My name is Issy Jewere, and you're watching the Log on Written by Issy. Today, I'm speaking with Lanaire Aderemi, who is a writer and storyteller and the founder of Story Story podcast.
My name is Lanaire. I'm a writer, I'm a researcher, I'm an artist. I love everything creative. I love storytelling, and my passion really is to amplify and archive untold stories. And I do that through my art, but also through my research. So I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Warwick, and my PhD is about a very untold historical event, which is called the Egba Women's Revolt. And it was basically a movement led by Funmilayo and Kuti and about 10,000 other market women who basically challenged the British taxation that was imposed in Abeokuta in the late 1940s. And they were successful in overthrowing that tax through protest, through strikes, and through direct action. So my PhD is just trying to amplify that significant but forgotten history.
That is so powerful. I love that. Thank you for sharing that with me. Many young Nigerians have been disconnected from our history. It's funny, I was having a conversation with my parents last night, and it's not only the young people, they've also, in a way, been disconnected from their history. There's a lot that hasn't been told, dating back to the slave trade, pre-colonial times, and even after that as well. So I wanted to have this conversation because when I came across your podcast, Story Story podcast, I saw something really unique. And I was like, I want to have a conversation with you because a lot of us are looking ahead, we're looking at the future, and we're carrying on. And not to say that we should hold on to the past forever, but there's a lot that influences, present day now, obviously. So that's why I wanted to talk to you. So my first question is, can you tell me what it means to you to reconnect Nigerians with their history?
For me, I think it means to equip them with lessons about events that happened in the past. I think for me, I see history as an encounter. And I think my own job as a storyteller is really to recapture people's memories by allowing them to be inserted in that historical encounter. So, for instance, in a practical way, that looks like, me creating a podcast where I'm using music, I'm using powerful storytelling and immersive soundscapes to make the listener feel like they're part of that historical encounter or that event. Because I think what happens with history is growing up, I remember being taught history, but sometimes it was almost like I had to cram, the dates or facts and figures. Whereas if your own understanding of history is more experiential than here's some knowledge, memorize it and do an exam, I think there's a better connection with it. So my own understanding of history is to, or rather, yeah, of history is to allow people to connect with their past through art, through storytelling. And I remember growing up, like my grandparents, they give us like books about folk tales. So like the tortoise and the hare, that's a very popular story in Nigeria. And I only remember that story because I read a book about it, not because they sat down and they said the tortoise is slow, the hare was proud. And so for me, I think literature, the arts, music, they're very powerful way to communicate, historical events. So my own job as a storyteller is to look into history and see what people can learn from them and then translate that through stories.
And that makes so much sense. And that's really beautiful because I was listening to your podcast and I was like, wow. Like I really feel I was there. You hear all the noise, you hear people kind of talking, and it was like that. This is beautiful. The next thing I was going to ask actually was more about your podcast. But since you kind of talked about that, I mean, you can share more. And then about the event you did last year as well.
Yeah, so the podcast is called Story Story. It's a 4-part audio series on Nigerian history. I was really interested in looking at historical events that people don't talk about or people might not be aware of, and events that I felt were also led by women were very important for me. So the Egba Women's Revolt was led by 10,000 Nigerian women. The Festac 77 was a festival that took place in Lagos, in Festac Town, as people might know. And it was a celebration of arts, of culture. And it was very much like I was explaining to someone that has no connection with their past. And I said, it's almost like if Afro Nation was to have like an event now, but then do it in Nigeria and maybe have a bit more like literature, poetry, music. I mean, sorry, they already do music, but maybe literature and history. That was what Festac was First Act 77 was. And a little story about it, which I haven't actually shared publicly. I was in Greece in October for a holiday, and I went there by myself. So it was a solo trip. And when you're on a solo trip, you're more open to life's adventures because you don't really have anyone to share it with. And my slippers caught, and I was on the phone with my friend, and it was her birthday. And I just stopped to, do adjust the slippers. And a man across, American man, he was just like, how you doing? Just like, just saying hello. And I was like, oh, I'm great, I'm good, I'm well. He's like, your accent, like, where are you from? I'm like, oh, I'm Nigerian. He's like, oh, that he's performed at the festival. I was like, no, this is so crazy. What? So it turns out that he was actually one of the band members at the festival, and he performed, I think he said he performed alongside Fela. So it was just a very weird moment where the past, the present, and in a way our future were all colliding. And at that moment, I realized the necessity of story, which is that it's not just about equipping people with knowledge of their past, but also getting them to imagine what the future could look like. And for me, it looks like a world where we're looking at the role arts plays, not just as entertainment, but as a way to create social change. Because he was talking to me about the impact it had on him as, an African American who felt disconnected from the continent, being able to come there and be a part of the story of Nigeria for him was very important. So that was the second episode, although it's in no particular order. The third episode was about Queen Amina. I really felt like it's very important to talk about, but to have stories about the North, because growing up, I felt like a lot of the dominant narratives were about the Southwest, maybe because I was in Lagos. And so, for me, it was nice. I wanted a story that addressed that. And so there was a story about Queen Amina. And then the final story was about Ken Saro-Wiwa, and, his tragic death, but also his fearless activism against the oil spills that happened in the Niger Delta. And so I guess the whole podcast is not just talking about the past, but it's talking about the legacies that our actions from the past can have. Because even though the Egba women's revolt happened over 60 years ago, the widespread feminist activism that we've seen in the past, in the 2020s, for instance, or perhaps even before 2020, so we Bring Back Our Girls, with the Abuja police women's raid, the Church Me Too movement, all of those movements, they're not historical, they're part of a lineage. And I think what I want to do is remind people that nothing is new. There is always someone that has come before us, and there will be people that will come after us. And we have to give credit, because when we give credit, we can learn, we can say, okay, these lessons, maybe we don't necessarily need them, but they were innovative, and we recognize how we ourselves as agents of change can play a part in shaping our future. So that was what I guess Story was about. And I worked with an amazing production company called Lupify Media, who specialize in providing immersive sound design. And it was during COVID, so none of the recordings were done in a physical studio. It was all through a virtual studio, and the voice actors were from different parts of the world. So it was a very interesting experience, and I learned so much from being a part of that. So yeah, thank you for listening to it.
How do you think that us being connected as Nigerians with our history would affect our patriotism?
I think Nigerians, we're very patriotic people. We're proud people of our country. Although I'm always wary of patriotism, because it's like to what end? In that, in fact, if I go quite philosophical, what is Nigeria in a sense as a whole country? Who made us? We know that it's essentially like Nigeria as a concept itself it's not even Nigerian, if we put it that way. But I do feel like in terms of how it can make us maybe better people, I would say being able to be transported to the past or learn from the past allows you to not make mistakes. So even from a day-to-day point, if I own a business and I know that maybe the way my parents run their business, they made a mistake. There was maybe one mistake. Because I now know of that mistake, I would not make that mistake again, because I know not to repeat it. I think the biggest issue that we're having as a country, Nigeria specifically, and not just Nigeria, but unique to Nigeria, is that history always repeats itself. I have never heard of a phrase that is so apt to describe, our country's illness, which is that we're always repeating history, and it's not the good, we repeat the bad. And so even when you look at the NSAS movement, for instance, when that was happening, I was really quick to point out to people that this is not a new thing. We've had histories of police violence even as far back as the late 1940s. When women were being beaten, they were being abused, they were, just really violent things were happening to their bodies. And so the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of police brutality, they're unending. And until you're able to understand what went wrong, you can then fix it. So for me, it's about understanding the mistakes and trying to correct the mistakes, but it's also about seeing how the fact that the people that came before us tried their best. I was at a talk by this amazing writer called Emmanuel Duma, and he was talking about the Biafran War and how his uncle, I think his uncle had passed in the war, and he was just narrating his book, talking about the book. And I remember when he was speaking about it, he was saying that apparently the only I guess way to memorialize the events of the war, the only thing that they have in Nigeria is a plain in the Niger Delta, in the Delta. So it's nowhere, it's not even in the east, it's in Delta. So again, this idea of as a country, we don't memorialize anything. We're not good at mourning, we're not good at honoring people, honoring events. And I think what that does is, from a psychological point, it also does a lot of damage because we haven't really healed. So for me, history is not just about, or rather confronting history is not just about learning how to be a better citizen. It's also about healing, because you're more rehabilitated as a nation, as a country, when you can say, okay, we did harm to these people, or we even did harm to ourselves. How might we move past this as a people? Because I don't think that as a nation state, we're very patriotic in terms of unity, because I think patriotism requires unity, and we're not a united people, unfortunately. But I do think that learning from history allows us to be more better human beings, and to understand that, also to understand how the powerful operates. Because if you understand someone's tactics, if let's say there's somebody in a relationship that is a gaslighter or an abuser, that, okay, this person, their pattern is they do this to do this to do this. But you can only, obviously, not to say that there's some people in abusive relationships who might not even be able to come out of that for various reasons. It might be very hard. So I recognize that. But sometimes when you know people's patterns, you can kind of dodge the bullets when it comes again. And I think what's happening with our country is that some people don't even know the patterns. We don't know that, okay, certain maybe leaders would, for instance, so that if you look at, for instance, the Lagos state that just happened, how they're using tribalism to essentially divide people. But we know that that's not a new thing. They've been doing this, before now. But if Nigerians don't know that that's a tactic, when it comes, it's very easy for you to then cave into that tribalism instead of you, avoiding it and saying, actually, no, we need to put a stop to this. This is not, a good thing. So I think it's also about learning to not, learning the patterns that exist that the powerful used to operate, because it's all a systemic thing. And then trying our best to, I guess, respond to those patterns with words that uplift other people, but also with facts. And that is to say that this thing is not a new thing, but we want to do better as a country. So I do think that patriotism is not just about, are we proud of our country? It's also knowing the way that powerful people operate to the sometimes seemingly powerless, and putting a stop to that way of thinking, because we want to be a united people.
There was a point for about 10 years where history wasn't being taught in Nigerian schools. And that was during the time where I think I was from primary to secondary school, really. So talking for, young adults like myself, like yourself, and people that are a bit older and younger than us, who kind of missed out on that fundamental education as we were growing up. What do you think we can do now, given that that time has already passed, to educate ourselves and reconnect with our history?
Oh, that's a good question. I think reading is very, very good. So even though within those 10 years there might have been a gap, I think literature is powerful enough to fill that gap. So for instance, although Chimamanda's Half of Yellow Sun is quite fictional, there is a lot of non-fiction. So it's inspired by real events. And that is something that is a very important piece of literature about the Biafran War, for instance. So I think being able to read literature is very good. Also reading articles. So there's one of my favorite journals, it's called the Republic Journal. And they're a Nigerian publication who they publish articles from politics to culture, everything about Nigerian and also the African continent. So I think reading about that, or reading from their journal, I also feel like watching films. So I'm a big believer in the power of art to restore and recover histories, and also histories that were lost and subjugated knowledge. So encountering art, and I think if the Nigerian government, for instance, were to sponsor maybe theatrical productions and films that were committed to educating people about history, our consciousness would be increased, because people are more aware of what had happened in the past, because knowledge is power. And I always say that there's a reason why they don't want you to know certain things. They know that if you know of these things, you would not repeat the mistakes, or you'd stand up for your rights, or you'd be more hesitant to indulge in excesses, which would often be symptoms of greed. So I think being able to encounter the arts is a good way, or experience the arts, so that you learn about it. I also feel like consulting our elders. So I only knew about the Egba Women's Revolt because my grandmother, she was very, very young. She was maybe like 1 or 2, but she was present when it happened. She's obviously, she can't remember it, but she saw it unfold in a way. And I feel like listening to our elders, because they have so much knowledge. They might not know everything. They might not even remember some things, but they have some knowledge. And I think it would be good if we could archive it. I remember seeing a tweet that was like saying something about how with our grandparents, we need to really record what they have to say, because they might not be here with us for too long. And so preserving oral histories is something that I'm really, really passionate about. And I think we can find a lot of answers when we ask questions, and we ask the elders questions. And sometimes they might not even know themselves, but they know somebody that knows somebody that knows. So really, I believe in the power of knowledge sharing, and that if you don't know something, somebody else would have an answer to it. So yeah, I would say in summary, consulting our elders, reading literature, and also being open to encountering other art forms like film, to essays in journals, reputable journals like the Republic.
I love how you said knowledge is power, really, because that even goes back to your point of how if we understood our history better, we would see these things reoccurring, and we'll know when leaders are kind of trying to manipulate us and do the same things that happened in the past, like using tribalism and religion against us. And we can see like not much has really changed. It's just the people that have changed. And also you could point on reconnecting with our elders. I remember my grandma used to tell me so many stories. Used to tell over so many stories. And if I recorded those things now, obviously I would have them to share with like the next generation, but I didn't. So I really love that point, and that's something I'm going to do.
Your voice notes are so special. Every single time I have my grandma or grandpa around, like I've become a sort of documentarian, if that's a word. Documentary. I don't know if that's a word, where I'm just like, I need to document this. Yeah, but yeah, it's true. Like the people are still, they're different, and some of the people are still the same in power, unfortunately. I remember I was watching a documentary about football, about how the Nigerian footballers won the Atlanta Olympic Games 96, I believe. Yeah, it's called Super Eagles 96. It's a brilliant documentary. I'd recommend it, even if you're not interested in football, just because it does tell you a lot about our history. But they were talking about just how the political climate affected the footballers' ability to play. Mentally, you're not in the right headspace. And for me, it was very fascinating to see how history is repeating itself, because some of the people that they mentioned that were in power or have proximity to people that were in power just ruled recently or are still ruling. So yeah, history is very important.
It is really important. Thank you for sharing. I feel like I've learned so much from this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with me.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.